Certainly we give God glory.
Amen.
God is a good God. It's good to be here. Since I'm before Father Andrew, he informed me that Catholics only preach 10 minutes so that I can steal his 5 minutes.
Oh,
right now.
But certainly we want to labor strong and not long. Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, verses 38.
what do you say?
Mark chapter 12, verses 38. Mark chapter 12, verses 38, New International Version reads, "As he taught, Jesus said, 'Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely.' Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, 'Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all of the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything that she had to live on.'" We'll talk about for a few minutes. Black girl magic, the poor widow, and the radical Jesus. Black girl magic, the poor widow, and the radical Jesus. I don't want to highlight the interesting faith and piety of the widow, nor the importance of giving during offering time, as many black preachers do, but the systems that the widow dealt with in this crucial and trying time. I like this radical Jesus, who is highlighting the systems that left her with a penny and a system that took the last penny. Jesus is speaking about the wounds of the widow so that disciples would be introduced to what it looks like for the church to ignore the economically oppressed. The King James Version Bible says it was a mite, but a mite didn't exist during that time. It was a Greek lepton, the smallest and least valuable coin in circulation in Judea, worth about 6 minutes of an average daily wage. New Testament scholar Dr. Buchanan Crowder tells us that the system called society that left her with a penny, she writes in True to Our Native Land, "A widow's pension is the social security benefit she receives when her husband dies. In some special cases, depending on her husband's retirement status, a physically infirm wife might be able to retire early from the assistance of widow's benefits. In each case, the wife's income is dependent on her husband's. Unfortunately, in most cases, the benefits were not substantial. For a grandmother taking care of grandchildren or great-grandchildren, the payment barely allowed for appropriate living. The pay could have been equal to something like the 2 copper coins the poor widow contributes. In other words, the society that the widow lived in was one that left her vulnerable and void of fair assistance. Does that sound familiar? The widow, who was a housewife, because women did not work in this day, was living off of the scraps that her husband left. She was living off of little and gave God all she had. The society that she lived in was so terrible that it left her and many other women with little to nothing. This reminds me of our society that leaves many of us without enough to live properly in the land that we call free. Minimum wage is never enough to compensate for the needs of anyone at any time. And this society during radical Jesus's ministry was the system that left the widow with little to live off of. How cruel can this be? However, not only do I have a problem with the society that left her with little, there's a problem with the church that took all she had. The scribes, you know the scribes, the legal experts of the day, were able to brag about how much they could give, but did not help the one that did not nearly have as much money as they had. Radical Jesus talks about these scribes. He said they have long robes. They love to be greeted with respect in marketplaces. Can't you see them? Hey doc, hey Reverend, how are you? They had the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor in banquets. He said they exploited the widows' houses by devouring. We're talking about the scribes. The scribes would take over the homes of the widows in faith communities as administrators. Also, for the sake of appearance, they recited those long Baptist prayers.
Yes, sir.
Does this remind you of anyone? We're talking about the scribes. You know the scribes. They were testing Jesus earlier, asking him, which is the greatest commandment? They were trying to trick Jesus. We're talking about the scribes. The scribes, the people who were so concerned about the law that they treated people bad because they wanted to uphold the law. We're talking about the scribes.
My Lord.
The scribes who were first cousins with the Pharisees, and they let their first cousins bring a woman to Jesus committing adultery so they could stone her. You know the scribes, don't you? Jesus says in Matthew 23, then Jesus said to the crowd and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do. For they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but them themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. I'm talking about the scribes, y'all. The scribes, they were a part of the council that had Jesus arrested and crucified. I'm talking about the scribes. And it's interesting that the church has become a system of scribes.
My God.
A system of exploitation because they took the widow's last penny and never gave her anything back. The church did not raise offering for the widow, did not get her a living pay, but the people went on in church with business as usual. Thus, we're called to change two systems, the society and the church. We will never know what will happen to this woman who was crippled by these two systems, but I want to suggest that she could have died poor because Reverend William Sloan Coughlin, the former pastor of the Riverside Church, says that poverty is violence in slow motion. And she could have lived and prospered because Jesus seen her given the midst of the situation. We don't know the outcome, but regardless of the outcome, we as the church are called to be that God's agents of change so that the radical Jesus steps in and saves and sets free. If you don't get anything out of the sermon, I want you to get that this church, the 21st century church, is called to be God's activist. This scripture will cause us to ask the question, are we addressing the perpetual problems or are we throwing money at the problems? The scribes were throwing money at the church and didn't care about the poor widow. You know, charity is a great thing for the church, but it won't be effective without justice. Charity says, let's throw money at the problem, while justice says, what must we do to stop the problem from happening? Charity can sometimes disempower, but justice empowers. And justice empowers because it puts a stop to all of the isms that we see in our society. Nancy Westfield writes in a womanist scholarly journal, anyone who coins a term creates a definition that has seized power and is exercising great authority. A black woman who would have the audacity to define anything, but most especially her own kind, her own thinking, is a black woman deeply in touch with the necessity for resistance in hope. And that's where we get this black girl magic business. That's what this is all about, to illustrate the universal awesomeness of black women. It's about celebrating anything black women deem particularly particularly dope, inspiring, or mind-blowing about themselves. And there's a connection between Black Girl Magic and this poor widow. It was inspiring and awesome that the widow made it in the midst of patriarchy and income inequality and living in her husband's shadows. And it's here that the radical Jesus is uncovering the truth about this affirmation of this woman. And Dr. Moody, you're being like Jesus when you fight for equal pay for women. You're being like Jesus when you ordain a woman pastor. You're being like Jesus when you fight for the woman's right to choose because male politicians shouldn't control women's bodies. You're being like Jesus when you fight against sex trafficking, like Father Flager did when he paid a prostitute not to have sex with him, but to release her from the oppressive lifestyle. You're being like Jesus when you address women's priorities in life. You're being like Jesus when you promote women's platforms to strategize and love on each other. You're being like Jesus when you embrace the ethos of King when he was here in 1956 and said, religion and the Bible, when not interpreted properly, can be used as instruments to crystallize the status quo. Amen. You're being like Jesus, and Reverend Tupac, as I close, shares his ethos in the Rose Out of Concrete.
Yeah.
His song, Rose Out of Concrete, he says, you try to plant something in the concrete, if it grows and the rose petal got all kind of scratches and marks, you won't say, look at all the scratches and marks on the rose that grew out of concrete. You will be like, a rose grew out of concrete. The same thing with me. I grew out of all of this. Instead of saying he did this, he did that. Just be like, he grew out of that. He came out of that. All the trouble to survive and make good out of the dirty, nasty, unbelievable lifestyle they gave me. I'm just trying to make something. Nikki Giovanni said, when no one even cared, the rose, it grew from concrete. Keeping all these dreams, proving nature's wrong. It learned how to walk without having feet. It came from concrete. Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete, proving nature's laws wrong? It learned how to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete. When no one else even cared, that rose grew from concrete. You see, you wouldn't ask why the rose grew from concrete, had damaged petals. On the contrary, we would celebrate all of its tenacity. We would love its will to reach the sun. Well, we are the rose, and this is the concrete. And these are my damaged petals. Don't ask me why. Thank God, ask me how. Brothers and sisters, you're just a rose that escaped out of concrete.
Ouch!
The widow was a rose out of concrete who survived a camp circumstance. Alton Sterling, although he died in the hands of a police officer, he brought the conversation back about Black Lives Matter. He's a rose out of concrete.
Amen.
And there was another man who was a rose out of concrete. You might know that man. He was a little boy that grew up in Nazareth, the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star, the rose of Sharon. He dragged that old rugged cross up the Via Dolorosa, and he died for you and for me. His name is Jesus. And demons tremble at that name. Oppressive systems are afraid of that name.
Amen.
My friends, we are all roses out of concrete. And that is Black Girl Magic.
Amen.